The smell of my aunt's green bean casserole used to make me feel like I belonged somewhere. That Thanksgiving, it just made me nauseous. "She's still doing that government desk job thing?" my cousin whispered to her husband across the table, not even bothering to lower her voice. "You know, the one that doesn't require a degree?" Her husband, a orthodontist who reminded everyone of that fact within the first 10 minutes of any conversation, smiled into his wine glass. I kept cutting my turkey. My uncle, the one everyone called the family's success story, set down his fork with a kind of deliberate patience that meant he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "Veronica, we just worry about you. Your father would have wanted more for you by now." There it was, the card they always played. My father had been gone 6 years and they were still using him like a prop. "I'm doing fine," I said. "You're 31, my aunt said, as if that were a diagnosis. My cousin's husband cleared his throat. "What exactly does a GS7 tax examiner even do all day?" I smiled. "Paperwork, mostly." That wasn't entirely a lie. What I actually did all day was build federal tax fraud cases against people who thought the IRS was too slow and too stupid to catch them. I was a special agent with IRS Criminal Investigation. CI, we called it. One of roughly 2,000 in the entire country. We carried badges. We carried guns. We had the authority to arrest, subpoena, and prosecute. We worked organized crime, money laundering, public corruption, narcotics financing. We were the people the FBI called when they needed someone who could follow money through 17 shell companies and still tell a story a jury could understand. Nobody in my family knew any of that. My cover, such as it was, had started as a practical choice when I first joined the agency 8 years ago. My uncle had just started making real money with his commercial real estate business, and my supervisor at the time suggested I keep my work vague around family. "People talk," she'd said, "and you'd be surprised how fast my niece works for the IRS becomes a problem at a holiday party." So I'd said government tax work and left it there, and over the years the vagueness had calcified into contempt. They thought I shuffled paper in a gray cubicle. They thought I was the cautionary tale, the girl who dropped out of law school after 1 semester and never recovered. What actually happened was that I dropped out because I'd gotten recruited. A professor I trusted had a contact. The contact had a supervisor. 3 interviews later, I was in Glencoe, Georgia, learning how to fire a Glock and read a balance sheet at the same time. But you can't explain that at Thanksgiving dinner, so you just keep cutting your turkey. The case that would eventually destroy my uncle's opinion of himself had started 22 months earlier with a referral from FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Someone had flagged a series of suspicious activity reports out of a regional bank in Charlotte. Cash deposits, just under $10,000 each, rotating through 4 different business accounts. Classic structuring. Whoever was doing it thought they were being clever by staying just below the Bank Secrecy Act reporting threshold. They weren't being clever, they were being textbook. The business accounts belonged to a property management company called Meridian Holdings Group. Meridian Holdings Group had a registered agent in Delaware, a mailing address in a UPS store in Charlotte, and after about 6 weeks of subpoenas and financial reconstructions, a beneficial owner I recognized. My uncle. I remember sitting in our Charlotte field office at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, staring at a corporate org chart I built over 3 months, and finding his name at the center of it, the way you find a crack in something you thought was solid. My supervisor, who I'll call Wallace, came and stood behind me and didn't say anything for a long time. "Is that a problem?" he finally asked. "No," I said. He looked at me for another few seconds. "You sure?" "He never came to my father's funeral," I said. "He was in Cabo, said he'd already booked the trip." Wallace nodded slowly. "Okay then, we keep going." The structuring was just the entry point. What we found underneath it was something significantly larger. My uncle had built Meridian Holdings over about 12 years, acquiring distressed commercial properties in secondary markets, strip malls, small office parks, the kind of real estate that looks like nothing but generates steady cash. What he'd also built, woven into the same corporate structure, was a mechanism for washing money on behalf of people who needed their cash to look legitimate. The operation worked through lease agreements. A shell company controlled by my uncle would sign a commercial lease with one of his properties, paying, say, $8,000 a month for office space that was never actually used. The shell company was funded by cash from sources we were still tracing. My uncle's property management company would record the lease income as legitimate revenue, pay taxes on it, and then distribute the clean money back through a web of LLCs to people who should not, under any circumstances, have had clean money. It was elegant, it was patient, and it had been running, as far as we could tell, for at least 9 years. The people on the other end of the money were the part that made the case federal in a way that went beyond tax fraud. 2 of the shell companies traced back to individuals with known connections to a trafficking network operating across the Carolinas and Georgia. We weren't just building a tax case anymore. We had currency transaction violations, money laundering under Title 18, and enough threads connecting to the trafficking operation that Homeland Security investigations wanted a seat at the table. We gave them the seat, but CI kept the lead. I want to be honest about what that period was like, because it would be easy to make it sound cleaner than it was. There were nights I sat in my car outside my apartment and didn't go in for a long time, not because I was afraid of what we were building, because I kept thinking about my father. He and my uncle had been close once, or at least I thought they had. There were photos from when they were young, 2 brothers at a beach somewhere, laughing. My father had always defended him. "He means well, Ronnie." He'd tell me when my uncle said something dismissive at Christmas. "He just doesn't know how to show up." Turns out, showing up and laundering money for traffickers are not actually in the same moral neighborhood, but knowing that didn't make those nights in the car any shorter. I also kept thinking about my aunt. She served on 3 church committees and organized the neighborhood coat drive every November. I genuinely did not know if she knew. That question stayed unresolved for the entire investigation, and honestly, it still isn't fully resolved now. And then there was my cousin. We hadn't been close since we were kids, but we'd been something once. I remembered her letting me borrow her bike. I remembered she'd cried at my father's graveside, even though she pretended she hadn't. The orthodontist husband was her problem, not mine. But she was still my family. I did not let any of it stop me. I want to be clear about that. But I also didn't pretend it wasn't there. The Thanksgiving dinner I described was 14 months into the investigation. I was there because my mother asked me to come, and I have never been able to say no to my mother about the things that actually matter to her. She'd lost her husband. She wasn't going to lose her holidays, too. So I sat there while my uncle talked about a new acquisition in Greenville, while my cousin's husband explained the economics of dental implants, while my aunt refilled everyone's water with the particular efficiency of a woman who uses hospitality to avoid conversation. And I watched my uncle. Not in any dramatic way. Just the way you watch someone when you know things about them they don't know you know. The way he held his fork. The way he laughed at his own jokes a half second before anyone else did. The way he looked at my mother sometimes with something that might have been guilt or might have just been indigestion, I couldn't tell. After dinner, he found me in the kitchen while I was rinsing dishes. "You doing okay?" he said. He had the tone people use when they don't actually want an answer. "I'm good," I said. "Your mother worries about you." "I know. I just think—" He paused, adjusted. "I just think your father had higher hopes. You know, for both of us, he wanted us to be something." I turned off the faucet. I looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "He did." I went back to rinsing dishes. He left the kitchen. 8 months later, I would be the one signing his arrest warrant. The arrest itself was not what I expected, which is always how those things go. We planned it for a Tuesday morning in March at the corporate offices Meridian Holdings kept in a glass building off I-77. My uncle was a creature of routine. In by 8:15, coffee from the car in the lobby, elevator to the 4th floor. We had 12 agents positioned, 2 U.S. Packery, marshals for transport. A USA coordination completed. everything clean. He arrived at 8:19. I was in a gray Chevy Suburban across the street with Wallace and 2 other agents from our unit. I watched him walk into that building with his leather portfolio under his arm, and I thought about the photograph of him and my father at the beach. And then I stopped thinking about it because there's a time for that, and Tuesday at 8:19 is not it. We gave him 4 minutes to get to his office, then we went in. I stayed back during the entry protocol when an agent has a personal connection to the subject. That had been agreed upon months earlier. 2 other agents made contact. I watched on the body cam feed from a tablet in the lobby. He didn't run, I want to say that. He didn't run, and he didn't make a scene. He sat very still in his chair when they read him his rights, and he looked at the badge of the agent closest to him with an expression I can only describe as a man realizing that a story he'd been telling himself for years had just run out of pages. They walked him through the lobby. I was standing near the security desk. He saw me. For a moment, he didn't understand. You could watch it move across his face, confusion, then recognition, then something that collapsed inward too fast to name. "Veronica," he said. "You have the right to remain silent," I said quietly. "I'd use it." They walked him out to the vehicle. I stood there until the door closed. The indictment was 47 pages, 23 counts including tax evasion, money laundering conspiracy, and 1 count of bulk cash smuggling. The trafficking adjacent charges were handled separately by HSI, who had built their own parallel case. That proceeding is still ongoing and I'm not able to speak to it in detail. My uncle's attorney tried 3 different pretrial motions to get the financial evidence suppressed. All 3 were denied. The government's case, by the time it reached the courtroom, had survived every challenge they'd thrown at it. The trial was in federal court in Charlotte. It lasted 11 days. I was called as a witness on day 7. The prosecutor, a woman I'd worked with for 18 months and trusted completely, stood up from the government's table and said, "The government calls Special Agent Veronica Laine." I walked from the back of the courtroom to the witness stand. I did not look at my uncle's table. I looked at the prosecutor and then at the jury, and then I put my hand on the Bible and took my oath. I testified for 4 hours over 2 days. I walked the jury through 22 months of financial investigation, through the corporate structure, through the lease agreements, through the movement of money. I used charts. I used timelines. I answered every question the defense attorney threw at me with the same calm I'd spent 8 years building, because that is what you do on the stand. You give the jury the facts in a language they can hold on to. My aunt was in the gallery on the second day of my testimony. I saw her when I walked in. She looked like someone had taken something from her that she hadn't known she was holding. I felt that, and then I continued to the witness stand because that is also what you do. My cousin was not there. I found out later she'd known about the business for 2 years and had chosen not to know about it, which is a different thing. That part is still between her and her own conscience. My uncle was convicted on 19 of the 23 counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 60 days after the verdict. He got 11 years. I wasn't in the courtroom for sentencing. I'd done what I was there to do. I was back in the office by then, already deep into something new, because that's how it works. The cases don't wait for you to finish processing the last one. My mother called me that evening. She'd followed the trial in the news, which had covered it because of the trafficking connection. She'd never asked me directly. She's not that kind of person. But she called that night and she said, "I figured it out, you know, about 6 months ago." "I know," I said. "I could tell." "Your father would have been." She stopped, started again. "He would have been proud of you." "Don't," I said, because I wasn't ready for that yet. "Okay," she said. We talked about something else for a while. The Thanksgiving after the verdict, I didn't go to my aunt's house. My aunt had sold it by then anyway, along with most of what the government hadn't seized. I went to my mother's apartment instead. We made a small turkey, just the 2 of us, and watched one of those old movies she likes where everyone talks too fast and wears hats indoors. At one point she looked at me and said, "You never told me what you really did." "I know." "Were you protecting me?" I thought about it. Partly Partly I just didn't want anyone to use it for anything. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's deciding not to push. Well, she said finally, refilling her own glass, I always knew you weren't doing paperwork. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in longer than I could pinpoint. My mother smiled at her movie, satisfied with herself, and the turkey was a little dry. But neither of us said so, and outside it was getting dark the way it does in November, early and without apology, and I thought about my father at that beach in the photograph, and I hoped, wherever he was, that he could see the whole picture now, not just the part where I dropped out, the whole thing. I think he would have understood. There's a photograph I keep thinking about. 2 brothers at a beach somewhere, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. My father is in it, so is my uncle. Neither of them knows yet what the other will become or won't become or will choose to let himself become when the pressure and the money get heavy enough. That photograph is part of why this whole thing took so long to sit right with me. I've turned the case over in my mind more times than I can count, not because I regret it, but because I think there's something worth understanding in how it happened. My uncle wasn't born into the choices he made. He built toward them slowly, one rationalization at a time, until the person he'd started as was so far back in the rear view he couldn't even see him anymore. That's not destiny. That's arithmetic. Every decision you make either builds something or erodes something, and the erosion is quiet enough that you can ignore it for years before the whole structure gives. What I keep coming back to is that the work I do, the work I never talked about at family dinners, is fundamentally about exactly that. Following money is following choices. Every transaction in a financial record is a decision someone made. And when you lay them all out in sequence, the story they tell is always a story about character or the slow loss of it. I didn't stay in law school. I made a different choice. For a long time, my family read that as failure, and I let them because the alternative required explaining things I wasn't allowed to explain. But the choice I made demanded more from me than law school ever would have. More precision, more patience, more willingness to sit with hard facts and harder feelings without flinching. You don't build a 22-month financial fraud case by being clever. You build it by being relentless in the quietest possible way, by showing up every day and doing the unglamorous work of understanding something complicated well enough to explain it simply. I think about my mother saying she'd figured it out 6 months before the verdict. She'd watched me without asking, trusted me without knowing, and held her own grief about my uncle at arm's length long enough to let the process work. That kind of integrity, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, is something I learned from her long before I ever wore a badge. And I think about what it actually costs to do the right thing when the right thing has a name you know and a face you've seen at Thanksgiving. The cost is real. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. There were nights in my car that were genuinely hard, but I've come to believe that the difficulty of a choice is not a reason to avoid it. It's usually a sign that the choice matters. My uncle had every advantage I didn't. He had the degree, the money, the family's confidence. What he didn't have, in the end, was the willingness to do hard things with honesty, and that turned out to be the only thing that actually counted. I hope the photograph of those 2 brothers is somewhere in my mother's apartment, in a box she hasn't decided what to do with yet. I hope she keeps it. Not because what my uncle did should be forgotten, but because my father's face in it is worth preserving. A man who believed that how you move through the world eventually catches up with you, one way or another. He was right, it always does.